States' relationships with each other are maintained by several key components of the original Constitution. During the colonial period, and even during the years the country was ruled by the Articles of Confederation, colonies or states would create policies that worked against other colonies or states. For example, if one state's government refused to extradite criminals or hold individuals accountable for civil judgments and lawsuits in another state, this led to tension between the governments of neighboring states. To prevent this from happening in the future, the Founding Fathers wrote several clauses into the new Constitution to help maintain and build a more perfect union by forcing states to cooperate with one another. Specifically, the Full Faith and Credit Clause, found in Article 4, Section 1 of the Constitution. The Constitution states that individual states must recognize official documents and legal judgments given in other states. For example, if I was involved in a car accident in North Carolina with a person from Georgia, and the person from Georgia caused the accident, I can sue them for damages from the accident. If a state court in North Carolina ruled that the individual from Georgia should pay me $2,000, Georgia should help ensure that I receive my payments through the force of their own legal system. Another clause in the Constitution that helped to maintain positive working relationships between states is the Privileges and Immunities Clause, found also in Article 4, Section 2. This clause states that citizens of one state, when traveling through other states, have the same rights as citizens of other states. Put more simply, this clause was meant to ensure equitable rights for citizens among and between the various states. For example, even if I live in North Carolina, I should be able to buy property in other states. I should be able to bring and defend legal actions in the state courts against citizens of other states. I should also pay the same sales tax as residents of the states. Some states may want to charge residents of other states higher tolls on highways, for example, but that would create a system that was preferential to in-state residents over out-of-state residents. The founders realized this could lead to tension and caused the constitutional clause and use this constitutional clause to prevent states from favoring their own residents over residents of other states. In addition, a criminal from one state flees to another state. If a criminal from one state flees to another state, the other state must extradite or capture and turn the criminal back over to the state from which they fled. This is called an extradition agreement and helps to maintain positive, respectful, and unified relationships between the states. There are two types of federalism that you should be familiar with: dual federalism and cooperative federalism. Dual federalism is a system where you have both a national and state government governing society, but the areas they have jurisdiction over are mostly separate. The Constitution was originally written with clearer divisions between state and national authorities than we have today. For example, the national government would handle things like international trade and the creation of a military. States would have nothing to do with those issues. States, on the other hand, could set educational, marriage, and driver's license requirements for the residents with zero interference from the federal government. In the early days of the United States, the federal and state governments operated mostly independent from one another, like a layer cake, where there is clear separation of powers between the various levels of government. This system of dual federalism ended in the 1930s once the New Deal programs began to blend the power and authority of the governmental levels. The second type of federalism you should be familiar with is called cooperative federalism. Under a system using cooperative federalism, the lines between federal and state government authority are blurred. This system would look more like a marble cake where the layers are blended together. Under this system, the federal government may issue regulations or mandates states must abide by. The federal government could also create programs that are funded by federal taxation but administered or run by the state governments, so states have some ability to design the implementation of the programs themselves as long as they abide by federal standards. Fiscal federalism means the use of funds from one level of government to persuade another level of government to adopt some policy or to assist a lower level of government in solving some issue. This is the cornerstone of the national government's relationship with state and local governments. Money controls everything. If the federal government gives money to states and local governments to do what they want, they can get the local governments to agree to implement policies the federal government thinks are best. For example, the national government under President Barack Obama asked states to implement a set of standards created by educational professionals to help streamline education across various states. In return, the states would receive federal grants to help train educators on these standards, which would then be implemented in schools across the nation. It was ultimately up to states to adopt the new standards because education is a reserved power. However, it was difficult for states to say no to millions of dollars in education funding from the federal government, so many states accepted these new standards. These new standards are known as the Common Core standards. Speaking of intergovernmental revenue, the distribution of federal monies to state and local governments is given through the use of something called grants. There are two types of grants, categorical and block grants. Categorical grants are when the federal government gives money to state government leaders, but the money comes with specific implementation standards. These strings mean states have little say in how the money is spent once they accept the money. An example of a federal grant was the interstate highway system. To encourage states to build into the interstate highway system to make transportation and the movement of goods and people across state lines easier, the federal government gave states categorical grants to fund the construction. The federal government funded 90% of the nation's interstates, even though the actual construction was planned and overseen by the state governments. Other examples of categorical grants include Head Start and the food stamp programs. These programs allow the federal government to control states by offering them money in return for policy changes. Project grants are awarded to states that have the most innovative ideas on how to address societal concerns. Formula grants like Medicaid and Social Security Disability are awarded to states based on formulas based on the need within each state. Some states may get more than others if their state has more people or more people in need. Block grants, on the other hand, are chunks of money given by the federal government to states without strings attached. Grants are given to state and local governments to spend on a broad category, and the state gets to decide how to spend the money. The use of block grants is preferable to state leaders because they want to operate freely of too much control from Washington. An easy way to understand the difference between a categorical grant and a block grant is by comparing it to a car loan versus a personal loan. When you get a loan for a car, the money for the loan pays for the car and it can pay for nothing else. This is like a categorical grant, money given to states that has to go to a specific purpose. On the other hand, when you take out a personal loan from the bank, you are given cash and are free to spend it how you see necessary. This is like a block grant. States often use block grants to address issues surrounding things like healthcare, education, and law enforcement. Over $460 billion is awarded from the federal government to states every year. Every state should receive something from the federal government. There are states whose citizens pay more money into the system than they receive from federal spending through grants, and they're a little bitter about that fact. There's also something called mandates. This is not a romantic outing with your bros. Mandates are rules, regulations passed by the national government enforced upon the states. If states refuse to comply with these federal rules, they may face threats of penalties as a condition of receipt of federal funds. Some mandates are unfunded, such as the Americans with Disabilities Act. This act required states to modify public buildings to accommodate the needs of disabled Americans. This meant modification of existing and future government buildings. The construction costs had to be funded by the states themselves, not the federal government, even though it was federally regulated to modify the buildings. States typically do not like unfunded mandates because it is the federal government telling them how to spend their own money, even if the federal policies seem reasonable. This slide summarizes some of the key points we've discussed up to this point. Federalism is good for democracy because it allows for the various levels of government to propose various solutions to problems and tailor the policies to the needs of their region. However, under this system, some states may have better government programs than others. Others would argue the increase in federal control of states under fiscal federalism allows for too much government meddling and taxation. An example of the differences in services among states under a federal system can be seen in the differences in public school spending per pupil by state. For example, North Carolina ranks 43rd in per pupil spending. Is it fair that a student in New York, Wyoming, Vermont, or Alaska get a more expensive education than you do? Is that money being used wisely to increase educational outcomes? Maybe. This is a reality under a federal system because states allocate funds differently. Another example, Congress's current proposed tax revision would negatively impact citizens who live in high tax states like New York, but would help citizens that live in states with lower personal income taxes like North Carolina. Is that fair and equitable? Maybe. This chart again shows you per pupil spending for the Southeast specifically, and you can see North Carolina, even among states in the Southeast, ranks towards the bottom. This chart shows you the number of governments across the nation at the various levels. By the way, down at the bottom, the special districts, that includes fire districts and things like that. You should understand that the power of the federal government relative to state powers has increased over time, especially during and after the industrialization of the United States and the civil rights movement. Most of the recurring problems in society, like during the progressive era and the civil rights movement, require federal resources and money, not powers given to the states. Thank you for watching.